Hi, welcome to Screen Blast Repeat. My name is Kirk Horton. This video is the second part of a study into the avant-garde metal era 1993 to 1999. As you'll know watching part 2A before this, the reason I've split this part of the documentary into two is due to the length. I fear that people will be put off by a part 2 that is over 90 minutes in duration. You might have wondered if anything happened outside of North America if you watch part 2A. Of course it did. And this section of the documentary will focus on black metal, death metal, thrash, and grindcore. Most artists in these categories were from Europe, especially Norway and Sweden, but also Japan. So I'll cover these contributions in this video. I hope you've watched part 1 and part 2A leading up to this video, so please sit back and relax and enjoy the history of avant-garde metal part 2B, 1993 to 1999.
Black metal entered the underground consciousness in the late 1980s with the rise of the Norwegian bands centred around Mayhem. Their 1987 Death Crush EP took the spirit of Venom and the raw sounds of Bathory and mangled them into a murderous audio assault that justified their image as four hostile young men wearing corpse paint and brandishing medieval weaponry. It also leaned heavy on the thrash metal of Destruction and Sodom for its vicious nature, while some of the band members favoured the DIY punk ethos of the Dead Kennedys. This was dark music, dark to the point of insanity. It was also misanthropic and obsessed with death. Mayhem didn't just create edgy art, they lived it. Vocalist Dead committed suicide in 1991, guitarist and black metal gatekeeper Euronymous perished at the hands of the knife-plunging Varg Vikernes, aka Count Grisnak, in 1993. Their debut album only saw a release in 1994 despite work starting on it as early as 1990. Unlike death metal, which members of Mayhem hated with a passion, they wanted their art to be the most evil form of music in the world. That meant no trendy, gore-obsessed lyrics produced for commercial gain, no shallow humour, a move away from the technical precision of death metal, and antipathy towards the clean audio production that started to define the genre from 1990 onwards. The most drastic example of this was the transition of Darkthrone from their 1991 death metal debut, Soulside Journey, into the most famous purveyors of unmelodious, low-fidelity black metal steeped in basement echoes and inhumane vocals. Black metal should never have a place in the mainstream, but should aim to scare people the way an elite cult might create a moral panic for rejecting society and laughing at its degeneration. From an experimental perspective, any survey of the Norwegian black metal scene of the 1990s must start with Emperor. They navigated the early 1990s as a myth more than a serious artist, thanks to their part in the notorious church burnings and their drummer's murder of a gay man who propositioned him in a Lillehammer park in 1992. This all changed when their 1994 debut in the Nightside Eclipse reverberated through the underground. Here was a band that placed a big emphasis on synthesizers and symphonics without compromising the misanthropic brutality of their art. Understandably, hype and expectations were sky high for the sophomore LP, and it did not disappoint. 1997's anthems to the Welkin at Dust started with clean arpeggios, multi-layered whispers, electronic snares, and military bugles that soon gave way to violent blast beats and tremolo riffing. Clearly, this would not conform to any notions of what a black metal band should be. Much of it was new at the time: the hiss of the dissonant chords, the clarity of the murderous drums, the heroic horn arrangements, the nocturnal glow of the keyboards, the complex scale patterns. Not only was it heavier than its contemporaries for speed and intensity, but it also expanded the maudlin introspection with melodic guitar phrasings. Not since Celtic Frost changed the face of metal with 1987's Into the Pandemonium had any artist created something as imperious or as daring in its pomposity and sophistication. But unlike the Swiss legends, Emperor also had the technical ability to execute their vision with no need for outside musicians. Terrorizer magazine awarded it their Album of the Year for 1997, and it left a mark on black metal pioneers Mayhem when they returned in 2000 with their controversial Grand Declaration of War album. Ultimately, Anthems to the Welkin at Dust showed that experimentation and a love of classical music could redefine heavy beyond the necro black metal popularised by Darkthrone in the early 1990s. Perhaps the most unique of the black metal bands to emerge from Norway's golden 1990s was Oslo trio Verdbunds Ende. They released one album in 1995 and split in 1997. Only with the passage of another decade did 1995's Written in Waters receive its dues as a landmark record in avant-garde black metal. Musically, it was closer to Voivod than Mayhem and Burzum, often leading with spindly bass patterns which the drums had no intention of following in a traditional rock rhythm. Add in the abstract chord phrasings of Vikotnik, aka Yusuf Pervaz, and the drummer's wavy vocal incantations, and you had an LP of 58 minutes of hallucinogenic chaos ensconced in the science of technical musicianship. Songs like You That May Wither and the finale of Den Zakalte enhanced their black metal credentials, but the experimentation of its magic would not be out of place on a Frank Zappa album if you remove the sinister doom metal stitching. Clearly, jazz fusion was already a foundation stone in the song Coiled in Wings. Like Emperor, they had no concerns about using keyboards to expand the dimensions of their music, nor did they have any time for gothic posturing, but they often stayed clear of blast beats as the engine of their fury, instead crafting their songs to reveal their mysteries through asymmetrical bass patterns and atonal chords rooted in heavy amp gain. Though the harsher goblin vocals might raise eyebrows, much of Written in Water felt like the soliloquy of a baritone opera singer masquerading as a showbiz magician. It could come out today and still feel like it arrived from the future. Vikotnik's co-founding of the black metal group Død Heimsgard with Darkthrone's Fenris in 1994 is a prime reason why music critics and underground adventurists view Verdbunds Ende through the prism of Norway's most talked about musical genre. Død Heimsgard's 1994 demo caught the attention of German label Malicious Records, who released 1995's Kronet til Konga and 1996's Monumental Possession before they signed to Satiricon's record label Moonfog. By this time, they'd departed with Fenris and undergone a radical transformation into an industrial-tinged black metal experiment. The new style emerged on 1998's Satanic Art EP and culminated in 1999's 666 International, which earned them widespread praise and laid to rest any suspicions of them being a side project. 666 International had little in common with Verdbunds Ende, though Vikotnik drafted in drummer Aggressor, aka Carl Michael Eider, from his former group for this record. Cleaner, louder, sharper, and with Audron's macabre vocals at the front of the mix, Død Heimsgard signed off from the 1990s by merging industrial beats, sinister piano motifs, and chunky guitar riffs interspersed with unexpected tempo transitions. At times playful and enthralled by the idea of a black metal interpretation of The Prodigy, the burst of a 268 BPM drum assault was never far away when the listener refused to raise their eyebrows any further. Songs like Ion Storm needed only 4 minutes to present a whirlwind of high-velocity chaos, yet Regno Potiri subsisted on 10 and fit as many disparate styles of extreme metal into it as possible while maintaining a fidelity to the cyberpunk dance floor. Somehow, the gothic piano dressing of Carpet Bombing and Magic coexisted with these as thoughtful instrumental pieces, but you'd be forgiven for thinking they'd copied and pasted unrelated songs together and included every embryonic idea from the pre-production phase in a mega remix. Nevertheless, Død Heimsgaard wouldn't let you forget this was a metal album with regular intrusions of grisly death thrash rhythms to satisfy the purists. 666 International enjoyed challenging existing preconceptions, but Italian group Aberim took many of the plaudits for this sound 2 years later, with 2001's Fire Walk With Us enthralling and dividing people in equal measure. The link from Verdboons Ende also leads to the most celebrated avant-garde artist to come out of the black metal scene in the 1990s. Their bassist Skull, aka Hugh Minge, joined the supergroup Arcturus in time for their sophomore effort. This band formed as early as 1990 and included Mayhem drummer Hellhammer, aka Jan Axel Blomberg, and Ulver multi-instrumentalist Christopher Rigg in their ranks. Their 1994 Constellation EP anchored their sound in symphonic and progressive paradigms, and their 1996 debut, Aspera Hiem Symphonia, did the same, albeit at a slower tempo. Until the release of 1997's La Mascarade Infernale, which decided that the progressive elements from the first two records should meet the avant-garde. It's the nearest black metal move towards a horror film atmosphere with dungeon synths and movie sound effects, yet the sinister carnival melodies were not too far away from Mr. Bungle. Here, Christopher Rigg exhaled his words through a shaky baritone voice, sometimes backed by the four opera pretensions of ICS Vortex, aka Simen Hestnes. The metallic aspects blended into this with ease, the guitars cutting through with magical scale formations, and the bass rumbling its low-end capabilities in the heavier moments. Often, mellifluous piano sequences shared space with keyboard string arrangements. Drum Supremo Hellhammer had the task of following the many twists and turns of this carnival extravaganza. Songs like Alone forced double-timing drums onto this landscape or circled the bass with the grooves. The classical flourishes of The Throne of Tragedy worked around a constant 4/4 beat and allowed the brass arrangements to lend their weight to mid-range guitar patterns. Whatever this was, it was no longer symphonic black metal, despite the impeccable backgrounds of its creators, and it didn't aspire to be either. Only Emperor and Venom's comeback record beat it to the top spot in Terrorizer's Album of the Year for 1997, and the publication would also list it at number 18 in their 2009 poll of the top 40 black metal albums of all time. By 1997, avant-garde metal with black metal roots had a centre of distribution in Suffolk, England. Misanthropy Records started out as a label to release the works of Burzum when no other record company would distribute the material of the notorious Count Grishnak, aka Varg Vikernes, following his shocking murder of Mayhem Supremo Euronymous. Originally, German founder Tiziana Stupia had no aspirations beyond seeing the music of Burzum in the public domain, but then started to sign other artists beginning in 1995 with Verdboons Ende and the Italian gothic doom band Monumentum. The debut Arcturus record followed in 1996, and others took notice. Norwegian progressives Mad and Mortem joined the roster in 1998, along with the English doom group Solstice and Irish black metalers Primordial. By 2000, Stupia had become the #1 patron of avant-garde European metal, but she grew tired of the scene and closed all business operations to study psychology at university. Today, she's a respected yoga teacher and goes by the name of Shrila Devi as the author of a 2013 book about her spiritual awakening in the Himalayas called Meeting Shiva. Two progressive experimental bands to receive Tiziana Stupia's attention in 1994 were In the Woods and Fleurity. The former issued their atmospheric prog metal debut Heart of the Ages in 1995 and followed it 2 years later with their masterpiece. In the Woods were restless in their quest to experiment. 1997's Omnio retained the group's doom metal roots but introduced an outside string quartet to enhance the sorrowful emotions. Though liable to change pace without warning and prone to long periods of instrumental introspection, it emphasized the pathos of the male-female vocals of Jan Kenneth Transet and Sina Larsen. The former could hold the heroic baritone notes, while the latter's range extended to the high C soprano frontier. 3 of the 7 compositions exceeded 11 minutes, many of them thriving on an Iron Maiden gallop at their most animated, yet the volatile dynamics were classic prog. Gone were the shrieking black metal moments of the first record, to be replaced by linear song structures that ignored ritual repetition. Songs like Weeping Willow drew from the gothic doom of Anathema and expanded them into thunderous heavy metal serenades with piano sprinkles and aching guitar harmonies. Too prog to be gothic metal, too gothic to be black metal, and too experimental to be prog, Omnio became an instant classic in the avant-garde metal camp. They returned in 1999 with Strange in Stereo, which had the impossible task of following the group's 1997 opus. Slower, more ambient, and less inclined to reach for the gallop, it did not try to be Omnio Part 2, instead sitting in a progressive bubble drawn from gothic doom metal. Though not a disaster, its recording exhausted the band and contributed to their breakup in the year 2000. Fleurity formed in 1991 and circulated their 1993 demo to the underground fanzines with considerable success. It landed them a contract with English label Aesthetic Death for the release of 1994's A Darker Shade of Evil EP. This was standard black metal at a time when the genre had started to take shape, though they received attention for the unique, high-shrieking vehemence of their vocals. Things changed in 1995 when they issued their debut LP, Minted Skal Koma. This effort broke with the tradition of the first 2 recordings by embracing shades of clean guitar, expressive bass lines, and clashing harmonics mired in distortion. Drummer Svein Egil Hadlevik knew he couldn't play blast beats over this, but he had the opportunity to test his speed when Alexander Nordgarden switched the tempo to tremolo rhythms. Like much black metal of this era, Nordgarden approached vocals with disdain, unconcerned if the words sounded like projectiles of vomit with no vigour behind them. Fortunately, he drafted in Norwegian pop singer Marianne As Hansen to match her voice to the ambitious melodic parts of their new sound. Unlike In the Woods, Fleurity left in the ugly black metal parts among the serene beauty of Hansen's daydreaming vocals and the fretless bass meanderings. Whereas Vedbund's Ende drew from Voivod's Cosmos, the duo in Fleurity did not. Their guitar tone resembled a post-punk adaptation of Immortal's black and thrash style at top gear, but they often interrupted this flow with tangents of macabre piano or quirky big bang movements. How these songs could be so blissful and so malevolent in the next instance is what made this record unique. After all, Fleurity were alternating harsh atonal metal with dream pop 2 decades before the micro-genre of black gaze dazzled the underground. They took 5 years to release a follow-up record, by which time they stripped out the DIY black metal extremities, embraced cabaret, and pasted in Björk and Massive Attack alongside the fashionable industrial metal riffs doing the rounds at the time. Unfortunately, Department of Apocalyptic Affairs was a new millennium failure upon release in 2000. They didn't release another album for 17 years after this event, but the LP could find a new audience and garner a new understanding if given the time it deserves. The band that Misanthropy Records missed or didn't have time to sign were Oslo duo Solefalt. Their 1996 Yearn Love demo would have been on Tiziana Stupia's radar, not least for its willingness to introduce the piano into black metal as a vital part of its melody. Italian label, Avant-Garde Music, saw their potential and issued the band's 1997 debut, The Linear Scaffold. It was an immediate critical success. The Linear Scaffold has all the dynamics and velocity of black metal at its heaviest, but the multiple time changes and love of navigating through the duality of smooth and the turbulent dimensions set it apart from everything else at the time. Here, bloodthirsty vocals coexist with baritone singing and thrusting guitars, often fed through bursts of bomb blast drums. If the music of Arcturus invited you to a macabre carnival, Solefalt were patrons of something more aggressive and schizophrenic. Songs like Philosophical Revolt weighed keyboard organs against complex drum patterns and furnished the metal action with the thrill of a treasure hunt. Red View was just as happy to fire up the fury a la Emperor, but only after reverse engineering it to appeal to those that hated yet coveted the dance floor. The grand piano skills of drummer Lazare, aka Lars Are Nederland, were also vital to the expansion of the Solefalt vision, as was the development of a spoken word style of singing by Cornelius Jackeln on Tequila Sunrise. The duo's sophomore album, Neonism, arrived in the same year as 666 International by Dode Heimsgaard and Department of Apocalyptic Affairs by Flaherty. Like these records, it assumed a license to do anything it wanted while retaining an allegiance to black metal. The Puritans were more divided, some seeing it as a betrayal of the genre, others confused that they sought an atmospheric, lo-fi guitar production for such an adventurous album. It couldn't decide whether it wanted to be sophisticated art rock, progressive metal, or an extreme metal opera, but it landed them a deal with Century Media for the next two records of the new millennium. Perhaps the most radical transformation of any black metal artist in this era occurred in the music of Ulver. The group's 1995 debut, Bergtat, sought a deliberate lo-fi sound with tame drums and distorted guitars that never intruded on the choral vocal arrangements. This was black metal in a permanent daydream, taking inspiration from magical folktales articulated in an archaic Dano-Norwegian language. You could believe you're in a folktale in the songs where flute and acoustic guitars contrasted against the shrieking noise despair synonymous with mayhem and Burzum. Kveldsanger followed in 1996 as an acoustic folk album with multi-harmony vocals and brooding cellos, and furthered their reputation as a unique proposition in the Norwegian scene. If anyone doubted their credentials, they completed this trilogy with an abrasive black metal LP in 1997 that sought out a basement demo aesthetic in the mold of Darkthrone. Consisting of 8 tracks, Nathan's Madrigal buried the drums under high treble thrash guitars and muffled screams, in complete contrast to the way their frontman Christopher Rigg handled the microphone duties for the Arcturus album that came out in the same year. It's against this background that Rigg drafted in electronic composer Tore Ylvasaker for 1998's double album themes from William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. This ditched the necro production of their first 3 records in favour of industrial trip-hop beats, but continued the band's tradition of multi-tracking the vocals into majestic choral arrangements. On top of this ambient sound design, they invited Steiner Greater to sing William Blake stanzas in a warm, melodious voice to match Riggs' narration. Something as philosophical as this had to be careful how it used heavier sonics without sabotaging the mood and poignancy of the poetry. The answer was to find these more hostile dynamics in industrial metal loop techniques, glitchy snares and baritone chanting added to the electronic overflow without tipping it into an apocalyptic abyss. This dark electronica received universal acclaim in the rock and metal press, despite its determination to leave behind the black metal that limited the band's artistic ambitions. Indeed, fans and critics have acknowledged that scaling back the harsher metal elements saved the group and allowed them to flourish in the next decade with acclaimed records such as 2000's Perdition City and 2007's Shadows of the Sun. One can imagine the praise lavished on Peter Gabriel or Craig Armstrong if they produced something like themes from William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in 1998, so why could a Norwegian artist invested in the second wave of black metal not scoop up the same approbation? It wasn't just Norway where black metal received the experimental treatment. One of the earliest proponents of the avant-garde came from the former Czechoslovakia, where Masters Hammer released their 1992 sophomore album Jilemnički Okultista on the back of 1991's atmospheric Black and Death effort, Ritual. Unlike their Bathory-inspired debut, album number 2 integrated harp flourishes and orchestral hits into its grotty metal thrashing 2 years before Emperor and Arcturus found their calling. The sharp, palm-muted guitars put them closer to death metal, but the quirky King Diamond theatrics, sinister keyboards, and militaristic horn furnishings were more like a bastardized form of opera than a heavy metal show. This melodramatic posturing might have failed if not for the abundance of vintage Megadeth riffing and highbrow Celtic frost flirtations. Decades later, it stands as a cult masterpiece from the European underground. There's no doubt it caught the attention of the Norwegian musicians that shaped avant-garde metal in the 1990s. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for their 1995 follow-up Slagri, which revelled in reinterpreting the works of classical composers and Czech folk songs and defiling them with techno beats and snazzy big bang orchestrations. Even Chuck Berry received his dues with an unrecognisable cover of rock and roll music. They split up 2 months after its release. The nation of Japan is not famous for its black metal scene, but it produced one of the most innovative bands of the 1990s and beyond. Psy formed in 1989 with an eye on the extreme metal coming out of Scandinavia and another on the first wave that preceded it in the rise of Venom and Bathory. Their 1992 Requiem for Fools EP piqued the interest of Mayhem's Euronymous and convinced him that his label, Death Like Silence Productions, ought to release their next recording. Scorn Defeat entered the underground 5 months before Euronymous perished at the hand of Varg Vikernes in August 1993 and received positive reviews in the black metal fanzines. Though the most traditional release in their catalogue, it hinted at what lay ahead with choral keyboards and classical piano fills punctuating the growling metal movements. London label Cacophonous Records signed the band for 1995's Infidel Art, which expanded the song lengths, experimented with bass baritone opera vocals, and inserted triumphant keyboards alongside the sludgy tremolo guitars. By the time they released 1997's Hail Horror Hail, Psy were ready to venture outside the black metal realm and into unknown territory. Hail Horror Hail is a landmark record in avant-garde metal, not least for its decision to embrace the traditional heavy metal of Iron Maiden and the dark pentatonic sounds of Black Sabbath, while pulling in the opposite direction towards Japanese bamboo flutes and vocoders. Mirai Kawashima retained his ruptured spleen vocal approach to the music, but glowing keyboard melodies surrounded his metallic guitar from all angles, often in a gothic or European classical sense. Now, flamboyant musicianship was high on the list of priorities, with all sorts of bass fills and finger-tapping patterns among the dungeon synths and timpani curations. Songs like 12 Souls experimented with pitch modulators and trumpets in a grisly Death Doom format and elevated the solemn dread of the concert organ. Sometimes it felt like you'd landed in the middle of a psychedelic horror film. Musically, it posed a variety of questions. What might the unfinished 1971 album by the Beach Boys have sounded like if completed by a black metal band in 1997? Could gothic metal learn something from the group's ostentatious horror scores? What role did Far Eastern perceptions play in expanding the scope of Western metal music? Indeed, the progressive synth rock brilliance of Invitation to Die could even rival Marillion if it ditched the deformed gerbil vocals. 1999's Scenario 4, Dread Dreams, ended the decade with Psy at the vanguard of avant-garde prog metal. This wasn't weird for the sake of it, but a commitment to put the Black Sabbath riff and the Judas Priest extravagance back into extreme metal. Around these edges were the pathways into experimentation via cinematic keyboard orchestrations and even big band swing. Of course, this was darker than a Swedish winter when you added in the dissonant pianos and doom metal motifs and discounted the odd slide guitar twang. Nobody raised an eyebrow when they inserted disco and funk into this mix for 2001's landmark Imaginary Sonicscape. Death metal had not resolved its tension between sonic savagery and sublime technical stamina as it moved into the 1990s. Should it aim to keep the spirit of Hellhammer alive, or push the speed and intensity to new levels of imagination? Morbid Angel's 1989 debut Altars of Madness showed that blast beats and rapid virtuoso shredding could be a big part of its future. The pivotal year of 1991 was also important to its evolution, with 3 records that elevated the technical aspects of the music. Atheist's Unquestionable Presence introduced jazz fusion techniques, off-meter rhythms, and slap bass into its gory mix, and approached songwriting through the mindset of the most sophisticated prog rock experimenters on the previous 3 decades. Carcass released their 3rd album, Necroticism, Descanting the Insalubrious, and moved away from their gore grind innovations towards longer structures and a cornucopia of non-repeating riffs. Finally, Death issued their landmark opus Human and accelerated the potential of death metal to new heights thanks to the prodigious talents of Paul Masvidal on lead guitar and Sean Reinert on drums, who inspired Chuck Schuldiner songwriting to incorporate prog elements. Masvidal and Reinert finished their touring commitments with Death in 1992 and declined the invitation to become permanent members of the band. Instead, they had their own project, Cynic. Cynic's 1993 debut Focus is now a landmark of progressive metal, but many of its features were avant-garde and still sound radical today. Using a vocoder as a central point of the vocal harmonies has never caught on, and maybe we should be thankful it hasn't, but this is just one of many innovations on this record. Its Buddhist mantras, neoclassical guitar solos, growling death metal passages, and sublime dynamic resets are evident in opening track Veil of Maya. Often compared to jazz fusion pioneers Mahavishnu Orchestra, they retained the complex structuring of the New York legends and embraced their psychedelic leanings, yet the death metal origins were there if you looked hard enough. Adding a shoegaze element within a jazzy metal setting did not appear on anyone's radar in 1993, nor did the cinematic rock textures of Sentiment or the eerie fusion affair I'm But a Wave 2 with its fretless bass musings and aggressive, palm-muted guitar patterns. Perhaps no other band had blurred the lines between progressive and avant-garde metal until this album arrived. Its death metal audience were not prepared for something so left field from a band well established in the demo scene as early as 1989. Roadrunner Records had no idea how to market it, and sending them on tour with Cannibal Corpse put them in the firing line of a crowd that wanted brutal death metal. In hindsight, how a room of bloodthirsty metal fans might react to the advanced melodic formations of a mystical prog jam-like textures is quite amusing. The album's tech metal closing track, How Could I, still sounds like it travelled to the present from a distant future. Few understood it at the time, but the likes of Meshuggah, the Dillinger Escape Plan, and Between the Buried and Me were paying attention and drew inspiration from it. Every progressive and experimental death metal band that formed after 1994 acknowledges its importance, and many would come close to plagiarising it if they could reach its high level of technical complexity. Though many cite Cynic as the first death metal band to undergo a radical transformation, the accolade could go to Austrian trio Disharmonic Orchestra. An early signing to Nuclear Blast Records, they were one of the first to recognise that death metal could embrace experimentation before it had solidified into a tangible genre. Like Celtic Frost, they were restless at a time when their music scene was in flux rather than settled. With no status quo to uphold and the competing forces of black metal and grindcore challenging them for supremacy in the extreme underground, they had everything to play for in a field few had even identified. You might even call them grindcore on their 1989 EP, Successive Substitution. Their 1990 debut album, Expositions Prophylaxe, was not too far from where Carcass ended up in 1991, but you could already feel something quirky in the background beyond the monotone vocals and violent drum patterns. 1992's Not to Be Undimensional Conscious was a natural leap from this prog-leaning grindcore with its jazzy drums and divergent bass patterns, often wandering away from the guitar rhythms. Their vision of the avant-garde was not the use of unorthodox or unfamiliar instruments, but the way they approached their song structures from a cerebral jazz mindset. Clearly, the Austrians enjoyed introducing sudden tempo shifts and key changes. The fuzzy guitar tone of Patrick Klopf was thick enough to operate with minimal bass EQ, but his voice stayed close to an archetypal death metal growl. Efforts like Addicted Seas with Missing Pleasure were closer to Primus than Possessed in the way they eliminated the traditional pentatonic foundations of heavy metal in favour of prog rock abstractions. Of course, this was still heavy, but seldom could you slam your body to something so volatile. A humorous nod to rap music in The Return of the Living Beat might be the first convergence of grindcore with the urban genre ascending to global dominance in youth culture at the time. Likewise, including a song called Groove, and subjecting the listener to 5 minutes of intricate time changes and bass shapes that conjure images of a hungry Venus flytrap was another indication that the Austrians had an offbeat sense of humour. Coroner were an influence, but few extreme metal artists were as daring as this in 1992. 1994's Pleasure Dome saw a change of vocal style to a manic Henry Rollins-esque voice and dropped the speed of death metal in favour of high-tempo ritual beats. Klopf's guitar was much louder and meaner in the mix, but his playing retained its unconventional note groupings. At times, it felt like three musicians trying to untangle their common rhythms and uniting only in the important transition points of their songs. Bassist Herwig Zamernick could go an entire track without following the basic outlines of the guitar in The Sick Undeep and Getting Me Nowhere. The experimental instrumental pieces anticipated the eerie bliss and abstract melody of post-rock. Though Pleasure Dome landed somewhere between Typo Negative and Captain Beefheart, Disharmonic Orchestra proved on their predecessor album that you could unite the worlds of Bolt Thrower and King Crimson. Towards the end of the decade, it became de rigueur for serious death metal artists to intellectualize their art with flavorings of free jazz and prog rock, but the Austrian trio were one of the first to explore these outer limits. If Norway dominated much of the avant-garde black metal scene of the 1990s, Sweden did the same for death metal experimentation in this decade. At the heart of it was musician extraordinaire Dan Swerno, who worshipped at the altar of Floridian death metal and envisaged a Swedish equivalent in his first band, Masticate. But it's another of his groups which released their debut demo in 1990 that signalled an early enthusiasm for pushing boundaries. Pandemonium was always a death metal band first, and a vehicle for disruption second. The band's 1992 EP, Dream 2, hinted at what was to come, and two of its songs appeared on their debut LP of the same year, by which time they'd evolved into a long-form death metal artist with an album arranged into 7 untitled pieces labelled by number. 1992's Dawn of Dreams starts like a flutter from Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, but soon works through a medley of low-end death metal riffs in its opening piece of 21 minutes and 49 seconds. Robert Colson's morbid necro-loss vocals are just one constant in a shifting soundscape of celestial keyboard textures and frosty death doom rhythms that often accelerate when you least expect them. Dan Swerno's main contribution here is his intricate bass weaving underneath a kaleidoscope of guitar changes. Occasional saxophone fills and dungeon synths permeate through the palm muting and growling like a pocket torch navigating through fog. The thrill of this record is knowing it'll be impossible to predict what will connect all the parts together. A shrill of birdsong can coexist with a loop of a submarine ping and a spoken word passage without deviating away from the riff-heavy action. Bloodthirsty moments of intense screaming might receive a brass articulation behind them. The closing track attacks the listener like giant footsteps crushing daisies under their boots, with simmering saxophones mopping up where the violent doom metal stomp cannot reach. Even if it sometimes resembled a puzzle, gluing disparate guitar parts into extended songs, there's no doubt that Dawn of Dreams carved out a distinctive European road to progressive death metal. Its experimental idiosyncrasies were unlike anything imagined by Death or Cynic at the time. 1993's Chaos continued this mix of obituary with hard rock and synths worthy of any esoteric horror film from the 1980s. Its crisp guitar tone and excessive use of cymbal chokes to transition between spasms of violence were as satisfying as the wild fluctuations of baritone sax. Songs like Lava could appear on any Mr. Bungle demo despite drowning in primitive Death Doom fantasies. The erratic dynamics of Chaos 1 unfolded under the cheer of simulated crowd noises, technical bass soloing, and deck scratching, yet it could go shoulder to shoulder with Suffocation and Immolation for audio savagery. A final album in 1996, Chaos and Confusion, saw them move from Osmose Productions to Relapse Records. They handed in a 4-song LP of start-stop death metal, spaced out with spectral organs and suspenseful tape effects. The closing track of 1 Minute Silence honoured the fictitious god of their lyrics, Ragunshina, in the most amusing joke of their career. They split upon release of the record, having taken the concept and the sound as far as it could go. By this time, Dan Swerno had wider recognition in his grasp in a more famous band. Dan Swerno is synonymous with Edge of Sanity, but so is the group's guitarist Andreas Axelsson, who fronted Swedish black metalers Marduk until 1993. They formed in 1989 and released 4 demos before issuing their 1991 debut, Nothing But Death Remains. This was standard death metal, but important to Sweden's rise as a global centre for the genre, and their 1993 effort, The Spectral Sorrows, put them into the top echelon. Progressive rock influences were visible here and in 1994's Purgatory Afterglow, but they abandoned all subtleties for 1996's Crimson, which came out as one 49-minute track split into 8 parts. Opeth's Mikael Ackerfeldt contributed vocals and lead guitar as they incorporated the Sisters of Mercy and the black metal of Marduk into their grisly metal sound alongside sporadic cellos. The album's ultimate triumph was the way it presented these forces without damaging the coherence of the music. Though more prog than avant-garde like Opeth, it opened Swedish death metal to outside influences and expanded the tolerance levels of the underground death metal scene. Swerno and Axelsson fell out after releasing 1997's Infernal, and the latter tried to keep the name alive by recruiting Pandemonium's Robert Carlson as their new vocalist for their second album of 1997. Unfortunately, Cryptic failed to recapture the glory of their early material or the excitement of their progressive metal phase. Swerno reformed the band with session musicians in 2003 to produce Crimson 2, which was a mild disappointment at the time, but many fans now give it their approbation and see it as a clean end to the band's career. Unlike Edge of Sanity, Stockholm's Carbonized started as a progressive death metal act and evolved into an avant-garde band, completing this journey in the same year Crimson came out. Formed in 1998 by future Entombed bassist Lars Rosenberg and Grave vocalist Matti Kirke, they persuaded Therion's Christopher Johnson to join them in 1990 as a session musician after 2 lineup failures. He took over vocals and guitar duties for the group's 1991 debut, For the Security, which incorporated virtuoso bass soloing and Voivod's dissonance into its raw death grind attack. Closer to Pandemonium than Edge of Sanity, it gained enough traction to warrant a sophomore effort, which the band released in 1993 via Dutch label Foundation 2000. Disharmonization kept the lineup from 1991 and established Christopher Jonsson as a permanent member at the time he was moving Therion away from death metal and towards an operatic and symphonic vision for his art. It was evident this would be a lot different to its predecessor from the smooth drum beats and clean guitars of opener Frozen Landscapes. More post-punk in its bass lines and shorn of the vicious high treble amp tone, side A of Disharmonization swept away the death metal in favour of an unsettling film noir dissonance that you might imagine Joy Division playing if they listened to krautrock. Only at track 3, Lord of Damnation, did they acknowledge their roots with dashes of headbanging rhythms juxtaposed with upbeat circus movements. Distant vocal ramblings often resembled that of medicated patients at an insane asylum and could be interrupted by funk guitars or distorted surf rock tangents. Perhaps the biggest change was the emphasis on summer melodies among the schizophrenic genre hopping. Side B was much more faithful to the spirit of 1989, but even the voivod moments of Night Shadows and the voice of the slain pig delighted in silky exotica melodies, often modulating through 4 of them like a cassette recording of the best bits of a John Barry soundtrack. Integrating a temperamental grindcore strain into this summer barbecue was no mean feat, and it felt like Thunder and Rain had come to liven up the party when they doubled down on the extreme metal elements. They released one more album in 1996 titled Screaming Machines and moved the core sound back towards dissonant thrash metal with noise rock elements that wouldn't be out of place on a Jesus Lizard album. Indeed, the Pass the Parcel vocals are more of an abrasive punk rock style than on previous outings, and the psychopathic tempo changes would fit easily on a Mr. Bungle or Thought Industry album. Though they never announced their dissolution, Carbonized ceased all activity after their third LP. Like Disharmonic Orchestra, they never received the credit they deserve, though in their case it might be due to the perceptions of them being a side project rather than a full-time concern. Not all the best avant-garde death metal came out of Sweden. England's Dark Heresy had been active in the tape trading scene since 1990, releasing 4 demos before their debut album arrived in 1995. Abstract Principles, taken to their logical extremes, won acclaim in the extreme metal underground for its ambitious mix of carcass and nocturnus with carousel organs and poetic folk passages interspersed among the dizzying rhythms and complex time changes. Songs like Thy Blood took you through the stanzas with a sublime alternation between Kohler Krauser's wise head voice and his carnivorous growls, while the musicians behind him concocted a background drama of labyrinthine metal rhythms for the tech metal obsessives. The epic sweep running through the music ensured it would never settle into a self-indulgent bubble. At its heaviest, its sludgy guitar tone and finger-shredding movements could rival Morbid Angel. In its highbrow moments, it could match Celtic Frost or even English thrashers Sabbat, who released their seminal concept album Dreamweaver, Reflections of Our Yesterdays, 6 years earlier. But none of these artists dared to introduce a piano-led swing from the cruise ship circuit and construct it into a death metal song as Dark Heresy did on the whole. Few albums have attempted to anchor death metal in a civilized planet as distant as Abstract Principles, taken to their logical extremes, and you can hear its enduring influence on artists like Akakoki and Hex Vessel after the group split up in 1996. Perhaps the most interesting death metal band from this era was Swiss sextet Babylon Sad, who released one LP in 1992 and then broke up. The Kairi album has all the hallmarks of Death's Human with its diminished scale soloing and sweep picking, but its downtuned riffing, heavy syncopation and ceremonial incantations were unique for 1992. Songs like Unknown Tribe and Manifest 05 are as angular and as challenging as anything by Meshuggah around this time, but they deliver them with the same malevolence as Morbid Angel. The difference here is how they coat it in a gothic mysticism and have the technical ability of Cynic to match their imagination. Chamber choir samples are as common as fast guitar triplets in Kyrie. When they compose a song called Seance, it is just that. 1 minute of backwards keyboard effects layered with chants that you'd expect to find in a Hellraiser film. The biggest surprise is the brutality of their breakdowns when the syncopated guitar and drums lock in to emphasize the component parts of a riff at its heaviest and slowest. Kyrie went unnoticed in the metal underground despite receiving a CD reissue in 1993 from Massacre Records. It was ahead of its time in 1992, and it still sounds as forward-thinking today, like a death metal version of Helmet spliced with Tiamat's gothic prog classic, Wild Honey. If Dark Heresy and Babylon Sad raised the bar for technical musicianship in death metal, Australia's Alchemist must also be included in the conversation. Their hardcore vocal approach and quirky Frank Zappa guitar phrasings sounded like nothing conceivable in a death metal format in 1993. One listen to their Jar of Kingdom debut will convince you that you're in a dystopian world governed by the villains of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Take a song like Shell, shadowing high-register post-punk guitar lines with doom metal riffs and building up to a death metal opera linked by a female soprano, is as exciting as it reads on paper. The most impressive thing is the hyper-aggression of it all. Double kick drums batter through the speakers like artillery, roaring vocals shout and gargle like the wrath of a warlord, yet there's always something to tap your foot along to in a moment of mirth. But make no mistake, this is scary music at the edge of sanity. Grindcore savagery has its place in the mix next to the occasional twang of a country guitar. 1995's Lunasphere continued the high treble brutality with blast beats and percussive vocals. Shimmying guitar effects and zapping keyboard presets added a space rock dimension to the quieter moments. How they produced something so fierce with subtle blissful elements and oral qualities remains a question that's difficult to answer even today. Though only 2 years after Cynic's Focus, Lunasphere could come out next year and still sound ahead of its time. Incorporating surf rock and the twang of Eastern mysticism into this audio devastation ought to have given the music a playful tone, but Alchemist avoided the trial and error approach of multiple experiments operating at once, instead subsuming them into the overall thrust of the death metal action. A year later, they had support slots with Fear Factory and a tour with Cathedral and Paradise Lost under their belts, plus an appearance at Australia's Big Day Out Festival to their name. 1997's Spiritech had some big expectations to meet, and they faced them with their characteristic determination to do the opposite to what people expected by including longer Eastern melodies for meditation and more electronic elements. The album embraced a grandiose vision of avant-garde metal, less anchored in extreme aggression and enamoured with an experimental rock that had no roots in the blues. Its embrace of Tangerine Dream's progressive synthesizer music and its use of deep gothic vocals to counteract the hardcore bellowing set them up for 2000's Organism in style. Before this, the group's lack of formal representation and distribution in Europe for Lunasphere and Spiritech denied them a higher media profile in the metal underground in places where they might find a receptive audience as the natural successors to Cynic. This appeared to be solved when they struck a deal with Dutch label Displeased Records to handle their European distribution for Organism. By this stage, it felt natural for their music to incorporate Aboriginal instrumentation, though shortening their songs below 6 minutes was more surprising for a group so fond of spiritual contemplation. No longer death metal in identity, it was just as aggressive in its heavier moments, albeit in a spiky Godflesh way. Alchemist were now a progressive metal artist, pushing at boundaries that did not yet exist. They were no longer unknown after their 2000 LP, signing with the mighty Relapse Records in 2003. which was then at the height of its influence on innovations in extreme metal in the United States and beyond. The group produced 2 more cult classics in 2003 and 2007, embracing a mellower progressive rock sound for the former and returning to their death metal roots for the latter before they went on extended hiatus in 2010. There are no plans to reunite the band, but their profile should increase over time when more musicians go looking for experimental death metal and find their name. Nobody sounds like Alchemist, but that could change in the future. Another Antipodean group taking death metal in a more technical and jazz fusion direction were Melbourne's Alarum. Mark Palfreyman on vocals and bass and Scott Young on guitar would go on to form the Levitation Hex in 2010 with Alchemist Supremo Adam Agius, but before that they made their name as Australia's answer to Atheist. The 1996 Blueprint demo showcased 5 of the 8 songs that appeared on their self-released debut in 1998. Though an obscure release for the record-buying public at the time, Fluid Motion approaches death metal the way Thought Industry tackled thrash metal. Fast, precise, complex, unafraid to include snippets of funk bass, melodic singing, and Pink Floyd when needed. Their debut would be considered progressive metal nowadays. But the commitment to maximum brutality while operating from a fusion mindset is idiosyncratic of the avant-garde angle on death metal in the late 1990s. Few were doing it, and few in the listening underground were willing to go with it, but it helped to usher in the next wave of technical death metal. It's doubtful many metal musicians had heard of Alarum in 1998, but they knew of them in 2005 when they issued their sophomore LP and secured distribution in the UK and Europe through Earache Records for their acclaimed 2004 opus, Eventuality. The most important avant-garde death metal record to come out of this period arrived in 1998 but had been completed as early as 1993. Quebec tech death innovators Gorguts were one of many death metal bands scooped up by Roadrunner Records in 1990 and then spat out in 1993 after the genre's popularity on the fringes of the mainstream went into decline. The band even doubted whether 1998's Obscura would see the light of day when they shopped it around the most notable record labels in the metal scene and received nothing but silence. From the perspective of 1993, Obscura is in a world of its own, and that holds for 1998 when it saw a commercial release via Olympic Records, which was later acquired by Century Media in 2003. As hostile as a sputtering printing press on a short fuse, and mired in sudden jolts of new tempo formations, its long, non-repeating sections take complexity to a new level and create the illusion of improvisation. You're unsure what you're listening to, but you know it's a sophisticated coding of noise calibrated into furious blast beat spasms and scalding guitar intervals that resemble human flesh touching a red-hot iron. This is metal music with no footing in traditional rock scales or modes, held together by autonomous drum rhythms and separated by dizzying bass lines that often decouple from the guitar lines. The intricate footwork from drummer Patrick Robert is relentless in its battery assault position, as is the anguished scream technique of Luc Lemay. Disharmonic Orchestra showed us what could be possible, and Gorguts shaped it into something tangible and coherent that used unpredictability as its main weapon. Though it became a byword for technical death metal and inspired a new wave of artists, The band's 1998 masterpiece has replaced Voivod as the main influence on dissonant forms of extreme metal, especially the avant-garde variations. It's fitting that their lead guitarist from 1999 to 2001, Daniel Mongrain, should join Voivod in 2008 and help to write the next chapter of their career. Today, almost every jazz-curious dissonant metal band, from Imperial Triumphant to Obscura, they of course take the name from the Gorguts album, to Horrendous and Tomb Mold, pay homage to Gorguts' 1998 album. There will be more to follow in their footsteps if extreme metal continues to strip out the blues foundations of the genre in favour of atonal jazz experimentation. Thrash metal in the 1990s faced a battle for credibility after it gatecrashed the mainstream, most notably in the Clash of the Titans World Stadium Tour of 1990 to 1991, featuring Megadeth, Slayer and Anthrax. In hindsight, this was the pinnacle of the genre's appeal as a youth counterculture to the mainstream. It's understandable how and why grunge dislodged the shallow hair metal of the 1980s, but why thrash metal had to justify its cultural relevance post-Nirvana is harder to pinpoint. Metallica had already paved the way for the genre to sail up the charts by easing off the accelerator in favour of a muscular form of metal with their 1991 self-titled masterpiece. The rise of Pantera a year later showed how thrash could evolve into something devastating based on hardcore aggression, heavy metal showmanship and a pounding groove machine. Yet by 1992 it felt as though the press and people's perceptions had assigned the likes of Testament, Creator, Sacred Reich and Forbidden into an overnight anachronism like Bon Jovi, which suggests the image of the genre with its mullet haircuts and macho image was the main reason rather than any lack of musical integrity. After all, nobody could call Nuclear Assault shallow or cliched, and did the members of Dark Angel long to be rock stars? Though the unfashionable Dungeons and Dragons cliche associated with Iron Maiden extended to thrash, it came back with the answers in 1993 when Sepultura released their hardcore groove metal masterpiece Chaos AD. This was an angry, politicised album located in the struggle for urban survival and punctuated with a devastating array of chunky riffs. Machine Head's 1994 debut, Burn My Eyes, added to the new style of thrash with remarkable technicality and a street credibility lacking in the genre until then. But the movement lost its need for speed and stripped out the Metallica and Slayer influences in the quest to downtune and cut out the flashy guitar solos. By 1995, those musicians, influenced by the groundbreaking thrash albums of 1986, were likely to embrace the meaner force of death metal rather than risk being labelled as nostalgists. One band immune to these considerations was Sweden's Meshuggah. Their 1991 Contradictions Collapse debut took Metallica and Creator and reverse-engineered them through 56 minutes of car-crushing action. Though lowered by only half a step, the guitars were thicker than aluminium walls and the rhythms were anything but headbanging primacy. It dared to be progressive, but not enough to alienate those with short attention spans. Few heard it in 1991 to appreciate its bold new initiatives, but the jazzy finger-tap solos, sharp syncopation and unusual drum grooves gave it a percussive brutality on a par with Helmet. They followed it with 1994's Non-EP, which caught the attention of Machine Head and landed them a support slot with the new darlings of the metal press. This record hinted at a vision where the weight of the guitars was as important as the crisp palm-muted rhythms, yet the most alluring feature was the subtle complexity of the drums. Nowhere did this become more apparent than in their 1995 classic, Destroy, Erase, Improve. Those that thought Thomas Hacker's drums were out of time were not alone when they first heard this album in the 1990s. The idea of a deliberate misalignment between guitars and drum beats was alien to the world of metal in 1995. Sometimes it was the drums, on other occasions the riffs ripped through the speakers at a faster tempo than the former. The word polyrhythm was in nobody's vocabulary in extreme metal around this time. Yet wrapped up in this complexity, you could find a clear groove anchor, even if it often felt like a double-jointed gymnastics performance. By now, they'd stopped playing creator riffs, instead opting to make the staccato guitars and aggressive vocals add an extra percussive dimension to the drums. Was it hardcore from outer space? Thrash metal from Mars? Prog metal produced by music teachers? The dystopian take on the guitar phrasings of jazz supremo Alan Holdsworth had no foundations in any lineage of rock. Perhaps the most surprising aspect was the restraint of it all. Plectrums often slashed at open strings, sometimes enjoying less than 3 chords in a sequence. Utilising a machine gun guitar effect was more important than working the fingers through the fretboards. Meshuggah earned the Avant-Garde tag in 1995 for want of a better description. Brutal, repetitive, hyper-aggressive, progressive, operating on daring equations known only to their drummer, their music produced a reaction of, "What's all the fuss about?" as often as, "What the hell is this?" Maybe they didn't know, but they planned everything with a meticulous attention to detail, like Cynic, whom they acknowledged as an influence in the album sleeve for Destroy Erase Improve. They returned in 1998 with more eyes on them in musician circles, but total incomprehension in the mainstream rock and metal press. Chaosphere is now a classic in their discography, but it disappointed some of their older fan base for abandoning thrash metal in favour of a polyrhythmic groove approach using 7-string guitars. No one can deny its crushing audio assault on the listener, though they might feel a spot of vertigo overcoming them when trying to match the drums to the guitars. Terrorizer magazine included it in their top 40 albums of 1998, and Tool handpicked them as openers for the US leg of their Lateralis tour 4 years later. Like Neurosis, it would be at least a decade before the first signs of Destroy Erase Improve could be felt on other artists, but the multiplier effect ballooned in the mid to late 2000s and turned them into the most imitated metal band on the planet during the 2010s. Grindcore emerged in Birmingham, England in the mid-1980s with the rise of anarcho-punk's Napalm Death. Receptive to the extreme metal of the tape trading underground, but rooted in the DIY ethics of hardcore, they created the most abrasive form of melody-free guitar music in the world, only a year after Slayer's seminal Rain in Blood set new standards in heavy. Faster than anything that came before it, thanks to the pioneering use of the blast beat drum technique, 1987's Scum was noisier than a toolbox being tossed around in a tumble dryer. Mixing Celtic Frost's guitar lines with distorted bass and the confrontation of Discharge, it also introduced the monosyllabic grunt vocals that would make their way into death metal. Even those at the heavier end of thrash could not be sure if this was metal or something too extreme to be taken seriously. Many hated their music, citing them as the archetypal example of nihilistic noise. The band's hard-left politics and endorsement of an anti-music stance said much about their interest in reaching a mainstream audience, though 1988, From Enslavement to Obliteration, landed them on the front cover of NME and knocked the Pixies off the top of the UK independent charts. Bill Steer played guitar on the first 2 Napalm Death records, but left in 1988 to focus on Carcass. Like Napalm Death, they recorded a scorched earth form of noisy metal fused with crust-punk and morbid lyrics about murder and misanthropy, cloaked in the language of medical terminology. 1988's Reek of Putrefaction has been described as a musical abortion by its vocalist and bassist Jeff Walker, but 1989's Symphonies of Sickness is a towering influence on the subgenre of gore grind. Like Napalm Death, it attracted the attention of English radio DJ John Peel, whose reputation for champion experimental and uncompromising music pushed them towards audiences outside of extreme metal. Other ex-members of Napalm Death branched off into industrial metal pioneers Godflesh, that was Justin Broderick, and doom metal legends Cathedral. former singer Lee Dorian. By 1990, the Napalm Death lineup contained no original members, and they flew out to Florida to record Harmony Corruption in the death metal capital of the world at Morrisound Studios. It ended the band's appeal outside the metal and hardcore underground, but established them as one of the most respected and influential acts in extreme music. So were Napalm Death avant-garde? Earache Records founder Digby Pearson thought so when he signed them to his label in 1987. The absurd speed and caveman vocals were unlike anything heard at the time, and the group's distaste for mainstream heavy metal, identification with hardcore punk, and love for experimental noise set them apart from almost everyone in the heavy music scene. Grindcore soon formed into a recognisable genre, with the likes of Terrorizer and Brutal Truth achieving preeminence, and its short-form brutality and spasmic dynamics attracted the attention of John Zorn and early death metal bands like Autopsy and Macabre as early as 1989. With so much murderous hostility to unleash and a penchant for recording songs of less than 20 seconds, Grindcore had a yearning for experimentation in its early DNA. How can you be limited by boundaries if there are no rules to begin with? American group OLD, aka Old Lady Drivers, were one of the first to use grindcore as a springboard into other experimental forms of music, recruiting ex-Nirvana and Soundgarden guitarist Jason Everman for their 1991 Low Flux Tube effort. Taking Godflesh's harsh landscape of extreme alienation and accelerating the speed levels, they produced an industrial grime record that elevated noise and violence above all else. 1993's The Musical Dimensions of Sleestak took this approach even further, with some of the most ear-piercing human screams ever recorded to tape. With less emphasis on guitar and more focus on creating chaotic noise, OLD were not a metal band, and their art feels directionless and nihilistic to the point of self-indulgence 30 years later. The gore grind subgenre was indistinguishable from death metal by 1992. Belgian group Agothocles were horrified that a genre rooted in anti-establishment punk and social justice causes had become a misogynistic cliché obsessed with murder, sadism and torture. They described their music as mincecore, to return grindcore to its anti-fascist and animal rights activism. By contrast, gore grind spawned the microgenre of porno grind with an exclusive focus on sexual torture. The punk scene in the US reacted to grindcore by stripping it of its death metal malevolence and channeling it into the harshest forms of hardcore that already existed. Artists like Man is the Bastard and Spaz had no time for metal lore, but they appreciated its extreme forms. Grindcore also had a notable impact on noise rock, which removed the crossover metal elements while retaining the short-form structures and berserk velocity. Japanese noisemongers Melt Banana achieved acclaim in the 1990s after Steve Albini produced their 1995 album Scratch or Stitch. Tours with Mr. Bungle, Napalm Death and Melvins put them in front of an experimental metal audience. They did a split record with grindcore legends Discordance Axis, and John Peel invited them to record a live session at the BBC in 1999. But were they an experimental grindcore band? Their 1994 debut, Speak Squeak Creek, is noise rock with an unmetallic grindcore pulse, and 1998's Charlie is a mixture of colourful pop and self-sabotaging noise. The songs are often shorter than 2 minutes, sometimes less than 30 seconds. The Albini-produced Scratch or Stitch effort from 1995 is the nearest thing to grindcore in parts, but the high-pitched cheerleader vocals would not be acceptable to a traditional metal audience, and the riffs are inspired by screeching computer game noises rather than, say, Brutal Truth. Nevertheless, songs like Rough Dogs Have Bumps could entertain a Napalm Death audience, and I Hate It is a sludge metal grind with a non-existent low end. There's no doubt their noise rock has as much avant-garde as punk in its DNA, but it's not metal music and doesn't try to be. Melt Banana do not speak for Japanese grindcore, but the Land of the Rising Sun had its adherents in the 1990s, some of whom showed a willingness to experiment. Multiplex released their sole album World in 1992 and approached their music from a deicide rather than a discharge angle. Bloodthirsty, highly technical, prone to the occasional sharp turn away from extreme metal and into the drum machine operations of Skinny Puppy, the dissonant chord choices and laddering bass lines offered a modicum of respite from the bludgeoning death grind. The obsession with forcing blast beats into every formation obscured some of the unorthodox impulses emanating from the fretting hands of Tatsuo Kibe and Noboru Takahashi. It would be boxed away into technical death metal alongside Necrophagist if it came out today. Their compatriots in Gore Beyond Necropsy received more attention in the late 1990s after signing with Relapse Records and releasing their debut full-length in 1998. Noise A Go-Go won praise in the niche underground for its harsh noise as much as its metallic brutality. Clearly influenced by Napalm Death's Peel sessions of 1989, it was too enamoured with being obnoxious to stand out as a leading new force in grindcore. 1999's Go Filth Go continued with more of the same humour, but introduced a psychobilly dimension to the crusty extreme metal. By this time, grindcore's practitioners had integrated a quirky element into the music, as if they wanted to draw attention to the sinister machinations hiding behind the gleaming white teeth of middle-class suburbia. Sometimes it was a self-indulgent joke. Mr. Bungle guitarist Trey Spruance released his efforts under the name of Faxed Head and wrote theme records around the trials and tribulations of the disabled students at Coalinga High School in California. Another partial Californian group, 7,000 Dying Rats, emerged in 1998 with a deranged LP called Fanning the Flames of Fire, which sounded like a turbocharged exhaust pipe spilling onto a strapping young lad landscape, with fake television jingles and lounge jazz interludes added for good measure. Those that wanted Mr. Bungle to concentrate on grindcore rather than the easy listen of 1999's California LP would have found something to satiate their tastes if they knew of its existence. One group that took Mr. Bungle's erratic dynamic shifts and multi-genre miscegenation and honed it into their own were Los Angeles quintet Don Salsa. At 1 hour and 14 minutes, with an opening track of nearly 32 minutes, Kool-Aid Mustache in Jonestown might be the most ambitious album in the history of experimental grindcore. They released it in 1997 as a one-off project with a limited run of CDs and received no press outside the underground fanzine circuit. The most remarkable thing is how much time and effort went into crafting the 60-odd mini-songs and theme tunes embedded into Opener the Deck, which covers every genre possible with bass, guitars, drums and keyboards. Yet Don Salsa never forgot their aims: to take pop and easy listening and defile it with precision-grade extreme metal. Yes, there were noise elements, but you could also enjoy high-caliber death metal riffing and human squealing amongst the joyful Schlager music. Sometimes the Mr. Bungle influence is too obvious, especially the nod to Desert Search with Techno Allah and the fascination with Arabic and Persian modal music. That's understandable though, as guitarist Jason Schimmel has been an active member of Trey Spruance's Secret Chiefs 3 collective since 2001 and continues to work with the Mr. Bungle guitarist to this day, sometimes joined by Don Salsa bassist Tim Smollens. Both achieved wider recognition in the next decade with their experimental rock group Estratosphere, which incorporated elements of extreme metal into their 4 albums and 2 EPs released between 2000 and 2008. Perhaps the most intriguing album to use snippets of grindcore in an experimental noise format came from Sheffield band thrash, who released this decaying schizophrenic Christ complex in 1999. As much a drone album as a repetitive sludge metal ritual, its use of fuzz bass, lingering pitches of feedback, and sporadic Yorkshire dialogues about the coming of the Antichrist are unlike anything from this era. If anything, it feels like 1 hour and 4 minutes of terror as a passenger in a descending aeroplane. Imagine this scene on a never-ending loop with crazed vocal shrieks and long sections of drum-free amp droning. Sudden bursts of screaming and atonal downtuned guitars lock in with blast beats and give you no warning of their arrival. You can even hear death metal tremolo riffing among the chaos. Much of it is improvised in the studio with little pre-production. In its calmer moments, the whistling clouds of feedback loop around metal bashing beats. The band split soon after its release, and 2 members went on to form the psychedelic black metal noise group, the Kevorkian Solution. Though grindcore attracted a high number of art school experimenters alongside the extreme metal connoisseurs and became a platform for unmusical noise, it also inspired a subgenre of hardcore in the mid-1990s that prized technicality as much as psychopathic aggression. This was not a self-indulgent catharsis for its highly educated creators before they moved on to white-collar careers, nor was it extreme music that enjoyed sabotaging pop music with barbaric noise. Mathcore took the atonal guitars of Voivod, the aggression of hardcore, the technicality of metal, and the cerebral elements of progressive rock, and created one of the heaviest genres of music on earth. Mathcore traces its roots to New Jersey hardcore band Dead Guy and Kansas group Coalesce, but Swiss outfit Knut might also stake a claim to be one of its originators. All 3 artists incorporated metal guitar styles into their vicious music, with Dead Guy taking Voivod as their starting point and making it as heavy as Slayer on their 1995 LP Fixation on a Co-Worker. On top of this, the 3 groups pulsated with the homicidal aggression of Napalm Death, more from a sludge metal perspective in the case of Knut's 1998 Bastardizer LP. At times, you couldn't tell if it was extreme metal or hardcore on steroids, but a constant tempo modulations and bludgeoning staccato approach were unusual for artists rooted in the latter. This frothing cauldron of extreme violence produced its quintessential record in 1999 with the release of Calculating Infinity by the Dillinger Escape Plan. It might also be the heaviest album of the 1990s. Calculating Infinity is the definition of insane violence as an art form, spewing forth a multitude of rhythms and start-stop staccato punches. Its dizzying time signatures and throat-grating screams are impossible to hide from. The attention to detail by its creators is stupendous. Pro Tools was outside of their studio budget, which meant the pre-production had to be watertight before they started recording it. Guitarist Ben Wyman admits he had to raise his standards in preparation for the event, brushing up on his Steve Vai and jazz fusion techniques to achieve some of the finger tapping patterns that existed in his head. On top of this, he and drum supremo Chris Penny were big on Radiohead, Aphex Twin and Nine Inch Nails, as well as Dead Guy and Today Is the Day. One listen to the opening 30 seconds of Sugar Coated Sour was enough to convince the listener they were experiencing an unprecedented event in heavy music. How could something with so many shredding guitar patterns and uneven time signatures be so aggressive? Was this avant-garde hardcore, extreme prog metal, technical grindcore? Songs like Jim Fear and Clip the Apex Accept Instruction were as complex as a Tool arrangement, but slimmed down to 3 minutes and accelerated to grindcore levels of speed with as many changes as a Thought Industry song. Often the drums would follow every note of a guitar scale at a murderous pace, or find a groove in the syncopated gaps. See the famous breakdown riff in 43% Burnt. Tasty jazz solos emerged in the most intense moments. Quirky Mr. Bungle interludes received the Meshuggah treatment. In short, the New Jersey Quintet produced 37 minutes of internecine metallic science to melt the cerebral mind. Like Napalm Death, the Dillinger Escape Plan raised the bar for extreme music by creating something impossible to pin down to metal or hardcore on first listen. Nothing sounded like this. The noisemongers and virtuoso musicians could take something from it, as could the punk crowd and progressive rock theorists.
Okay, that concludes our survey of Part 2B, looking at the second wave of avant-garde metal in the period 1993 to 1999. I always ask this question, are there any glaring omissions from this documentary? The gems that I discovered during my research for Part 2B were Flaherty, Disharmonic Orchestra, Pandemonium, Babylon Sad, Dark Heresy, Alchemist, Don Salsa, and Courage. And it occurred to me, when editing this, I should try to interview some of these people who left their mark on avant-garde metal. I should bring them on this channel and into the book. The one person I must speak to as part of this project is Tom G. Warrior of Celtic Frost and Triptychon. I think Paige Hamilton of Helmet and Steve Austin of Today Is the Day would also be interesting to interview if I'm going to turn this project into a history survey text. So why not let me know who you want me to interview as part of this series? Put it in the comments and I'll try and make it happen. I assume you enjoyed this video if you've sat through it and got to the end. Did you discover any new artists watching this documentary? I hope you did, and I'll see you in a few months' time for the history of avant-garde metal, Part 3, 2000 to 2009. Take care.